In September of 2018, Nvidia promised to bring real-time, hardware-accelerated ray tracing to gaming for the first time. So confident were the Green Team that ray tracing was the future of gaming, Nvidia's RTX series would go on to completely replace their GTX range within a single generation. If you bought into the hype early on and invested in one of the top first-gen ray tracing cards, would you still be enjoying the RT revolution 6 years later, or have early adopters been left in the dust? At the time of launch, ray tracing was not received particularly well. Of the initial 5 RTX 20 series cards, only the top 2 were considered genuinely capable of showcasing this technology to its full potential. When you could even find a title that supported it, ray tracing proved to be incredibly demanding, dramatically reducing frame rates when turned on, and recouping that lost performance meant either reducing other quality settings and resolution, or using early, underdeveloped and relatively unsupported upscaling tech. 6 years later, RT has finally achieved enough market saturation that it's impossible to ignore, and even Hardware Unboxed can bring it up in conversation without spitting and making a sign to ward off evil spirits. Ray-traced games are now everywhere. Nvidia's hardware has come on in leaps and bounds, their competitors have joined the fray, and upscaling tech has now improved enough that it can actually help achieve smooth frame rates without completely ruining image quality. Now the technology has reached relative maturity, I wanted to see if these early RT cards have aged gracefully, or if, like so many first-gen tech products, they've become nothing more than fancy paperweights. To find out, I've dusted off the MPG PC to test the best of that first series of RTX GPUs, the $1,000 RTX 2080 Ti with its 68 ray tracing cores, and the $2,500 Titan RTX with 4 extra RT cores and double the VRAM. I've tested both GPUs in a series of ray tracing enabled games from the last 6 years, with varying degrees of integration, from simple RT shadows all the way up to full path tracing. I would not recommend playing a drinking game every time I say ray tracing or RT in this video, especially if you don't have health insurance or access to socialised healthcare. Among the first generation of RT showcase titles was Shadow of the Tomb Raider. However, Eidos Montreal made the choice to limit its application to just shadows, possibly as some kind of pun. Arguably, this more restrained approach to introducing a groundbreaking new rendering technology was underselling it, and I don't think many people who saw the shadows of the Tomb Raider were immediately convinced. It did, however, mean that the impact of ray tracing on performance was relatively minimal. At 1080p, the lowest RT preset only drops frame rates by about 10%, and is still within the realms of a high refresh display. Even at higher settings, the frame rate remains impressively playable, with Ultra being hardly any more impactful than high, though a 30% reduction from standard rendering should start alarm bells ringing. At 1440p, RT performance drops below the 100 FPS mark, but is still above 60 on both GPUs. But 4K starts to become an issue. Both cards are skirting around the 60 mark without ray tracing, and enabling it puts frame rates down in the 40s. Remedy have long been champions of the PC platform, and they take new graphics technology seriously, so it's no surprise they were quick to jump on board the ray tracing hype train. Control's use of RT was ambitious, covering not just shadows and reflections, but also indirect lighting, meaning that a surface illuminated by a light source can then illuminate other nearby things, creating so-called bounce lighting. Control could be pretty intensive, and not exclusively due to ray tracing. Neither card can pull off native 4K at high settings even without RT. At 1080p both cards are strong, though the greater RT feature set means a bigger difference between presets, both in terms of quality and performance. Averages drop by 25% from off to medium, and another 20% from medium to high. At 1440p, this means the Turing cards drop below 60 FPS at max settings, so locking at 60 would require either coming to terms with how weird screen space ambient occlusion can look, or enabling upscaling. 4K, meanwhile, starts in the mid-40s without RT, and max ray tracing drags frame rates off a cliff. I couldn't make this video without including ray tracing's first killer app, Cyberpunk 2077. CDPR's long-awaited RPG was a colossal disappointment on launch, but owners of RTX GPUs wouldn't have been too disappointed with its graphics. And now, almost 4 years later, it's been updated to support new features like path tracing. Interestingly, Cyberpunk shows possibly the greatest difference in performance between the two GPUs. Without RT, there can be as much as a 20% difference in performance between the RTX 2080 Ti and the Titan RTX. Though, like with Control, there's no chance of either card running the game at native 4K anywhere close to 60 FPS. Low ray tracing again introduces a bare minimum of RT effects, in this case local shadows, and has a roughly 10 to 15% impact on performance. At 1080p, that's hardly noticeable, but stepping up to medium enables sun shadows and lighting, and that drops both cards to below 60, even below 50 in the case of the 2080 Ti. RT Ultra maxes out lighting quality and adds reflections, but frame rates are now in the low 40s and high 30s. Fine for driving, but shootouts are going to be pretty tough to handle at those frame rates. Finally, the dreaded overdrive mode. This isn't playable by any stretch, and the required amount of upscaling is going to have far more impact on image quality than simply turning path tracing off again. And that's all just at 1080p. 1440p is more of the same, but worse performance-wise, with RT Ultra now requiring upscaling even to hit 30 FPS, and path tracing's now down into single digits on the 2080 Ti. 4K absolutely breaks the 11GB card, with any level of RT being too much to handle, and path tracing causing the game to flatline. Forza Horizon 5 launched without real-time ray tracing in-game, only making RT reflections available in photo mode and in the Forza Vista showroom. However, in a patch sometime after launch, there were 2 more RT modes added. Both enabled RT reflections in open-world gameplay and in races, with the Ultra mode limiting reflections to half resolution and Extreme rendering them at full res. In gameplay, these reflections are limited to just the player's car, with AI cars gaining RT reflections only in photo mode. This approach is very lightweight, which makes sense. Forza is an Xbox tentpole franchise, and the Series X uses AMD's first-generation ray tracing hardware, released only a few months earlier. Despite this game being optimised for the other team, both GeForces handle the game's RT very well. Enabling Ultra RT has a roughly 10% detriment to FPS, and stepping up to Extreme RT has very little impact, generally cutting performance by about 1 frame. At 1080p, this means everything is remarkably playable on both cards. At 1440p, it's a little more borderline for the 2080 Ti, only scraping above 60 FPS in the benchmark run. Though it should of course be pointed out that open world gameplay is somewhat less demanding than this, so this is a worst case scenario. Native 4K, however, neither card will be too comfortable even without RT. Asobo Studios' Plague Tale Requiem is as good looking as any game on this list, even without RT. However, in 2022, it was also an early warning that games were about to get a whole lot more demanding on PCs, which is not what people wanted to hear during a GPU shortage. The developer's proprietary Zuna engine allowed for RT shadows to be patched in a few months after launch. However, it was not an easy transition, and RT takes a heavy toll on performance for such a minimal effect on image quality. Without RT, both GPUs are smooth enough at 1080p. Enabling those RT shadows knocks about 30% off the frame rates, and while that doesn't make the game unplayable, it does seem disproportionate. At 1440p, you could probably make an argument that upscaling isn't needed, especially as this isn't a particularly action-heavy title, and some people will be fine playing at 30 FPS. Meanwhile, 4K is hard to defend, even for cinematic 24 FPS apologists. These days, a lot of games are built from the ground up with RT in mind, thanks in no small part to the use of AMD's RT-capable RDNA architecture in the current console generation. Insomniac is a first-party Sony developer whose titles are often tentpoles for the PlayStation brand, so Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart supports a good amount of RT effects. The side effect of this console origin story, however, is the need for lots and lots of VRAM. The RTX 2080 Ti's 11GB frame buffer often proves inadequate when enabling higher levels of RT, even at 1080p. There are no RT presets in this game, and of the 3 ray-traced settings available, 2 of them have a minimum level of high, so I did my first RT test with all 3 set to high. This took a chunk out of the Titan, dropping FPS by about a third, but the 2080 Ti was gutted. It lost half its performance at 1080p and 1440p, frequently suffering from massive amounts of stutter. Meanwhile, the Titan, with 24GB of VRAM, actually looks pretty solid, though Max RT does bring things a shade under 60fps. 1440p isn't any kinder to the 2080 Ti, and once RT comes into play, the Titan's falling into that awkward realm between 30 and 60fps. Turning up to 4K, the Titan is playable-ish, though Max RT is just a bit too much to ask from the Turing flagship. The 2080 Ti, meanwhile, gives up completely, either being too slow to play or just crashing outright. Remedy make another appearance with one of the most demanding AAA games of the present day. Alan Wake 2 attracted negative attention, some of it from culture warriors, but I think its main problem with PC gamers was that it came along at a time when there was a performance deficit in PC hardware. Both AMD and Nvidia chose to throttle back their mainstream 2022 and 2023 GPU releases, meaning there still isn't really a mainstream current-gen GPU for playing these super demanding path-traced games. You could argue this is how things were in 2007 in the days of Crysis, but GPUs didn't cost anywhere near as much back then. Anyway, rant over. Ray tracing can be absolutely transformative in this title, especially when rendering shadows. In the best case scenario, rasterized shadows can look blocky and pixelated. At worst, they barely register as shadows at all, just looking like random chunks of darkness. RT gives perfectly rendered shadows even at low settings, with higher settings introducing reflections and the dreaded path tracing. However, all this has exactly the kind of impact on the Turing GPUs that you'd probably expect. Without RT, the Turing cards are capable of delivering a somewhat playable experience, but RT is rough even on the Titan. At 1080p with low ray tracing, neither card can manage to stay at 60 or even 50 FPS. Medium RT cuts frames by another 20 to 25% across the board. High RT is actually still kinda playable at 1080p, though not at any other setting. At 1440p, both cards drop below 30 with any amount of RT enabled, falling into the teens at RT high, and 4K is out of the question with any level of ray tracing or path tracing. Some people have theorised that ray tracing is like this generation's tessellation, an effect that was once incredibly demanding on hardware, but which nobody even worries about nowadays. If that's true, there may come a time when RT isn't something one can simply enable or disable, it's just there. And while Ubisoft's Star Wars Outlaws isn't the first bold one to make at least a bare minimum amount of ray tracing integral to the game, it is one of the few that isn't a remaster or modded version of an older game. This is the first title of the video that I've tested below the maximum quality setting. I did start out at Ultra, but VRAM became an issue for the 2080 Ti much earlier, so I limited testing to the high presets. Both cards are rather playable at 1080p, which these days is perhaps all we can expect from 6-year-old GPUs. However, this isn't the only RT aspect of Outlaws, as there's an additional slider called RTX DI, which gives far more accurate and visually appealing shadows and reflections. Turning this on cuts frame rates by almost 40% even at the low setting, and there are 4 settings more intensive than that. RTX DI Max is hidden and requires enabling in a command line argument, but in this case it should remain hidden. At 1440p you don't want to enable RTX DI unless it's the lowest level, or you intend using DLSS, which we'll look at soon. At 4K, you shouldn't turn it on at all, especially on an RTX 2080 Ti. SWO has high VRAM demands, but if you can't meet them, it usually handles things pretty gracefully, dropping levels of detail and texture quality on the fly without harming performance. However, at this resolution, the 11GB on the 2080 Ti is just nowhere near enough, and the game is either an unplayable mess or crashes to desktop. After seemingly being in development forever, Black Myth Wukong, I must not call it Wu-Tang, finally dropped in 2024, and of course it weighs a ton. Even without RT, it's a demanding game, causing several PC benchmarking outlets to devise their own optimised settings. For convenience, I've limited myself to the built-in presets, though I've manually adjusted resolution scaling to 100%. This is another of those games that annoyingly changes resolution scaling without your input. At the high preset, neither card is capable of guaranteed 60fps even at 1080p, though they both have frame rates that I think most people would find acceptable. When it comes to ray tracing, Wukong likes it raw. It's using full-fledged path tracing, and at its maximum setting this is utterly devastating to first-gen hardware. At low, the benchmark looks kinda weird. The lack of RT reflections means the water that occupies half the screen at the beginning of the test run is glowing, but despite this, the impact on performance is still significant, with averages cut in half. RT Medium adds reflections to the roster of RT effects, which solves the water issue but has a surprisingly small performance impact compared to low. The very high preset is the dreaded full path tracing option, and that turns even 1080p into a slideshow. At native 1440p, I'd find it hard to argue for either card with RT enabled, though without RT it's at least kinda playable. At 4K, you really need to consider using DLSS, because even turning RT off can't achieve 30fps. So far, I haven't really brought up the other half of the RTX equation. Deep learning supersampling has been every bit as influential on the industry since its invention, and remains one of the key selling points of Nvidia's GPUs to this day. Although many of us who focus on gaming performance tend to think of DLSS as the solution to the current performance deficits, it was originally intended as a way of offsetting the impact of ray tracing. I haven't benchmarked it yet because, well, I've had to run hundreds of benchmarks for this video already, and throwing in all 4 DLSS presets would mean I'd still be making this video by the time RTX turned 7. I didn't want to ignore it, however, so I used DLSS to answer the question, can these first-gen GPUs still hold up with RT settings cranked to their maximum? As a first-generation RT title, Shadow of the Tomb Raider isn't hard to bring up to 60fps with ray tracing enabled. As we've already seen, both the RTX 2080 Ti and Titan RTX are capable of 1080p and 1440p, well above 60fps. And even at 4K with shadows maxed out, DLSS balanced can bring both cards up to a 60+ average. Despite being a much heavier title to run, Control can also hit a 60 average on the Titan with DLSS balanced, though not quite as assuredly as with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. The 2080 Ti is a few frames short of the 60 mark, and both cards will be smoother at DLSS performance, but quality does start to decline at that point, especially in a game that already shows a lot of ray tracing related noise. Most noticeable is the ghosting, which isn't hard to spot. Every time I round one of these corners, a kind of blurry shadow follows the wall. Path tracing proves to be Turing's Achilles heel, and yet it's still possible that DLSS can make Cyberpunk's RT Overdrive setting playable. DLSS Ultra Performance is a huge drop in render resolution, and its effect on image quality is severe. But if you don't mind the game looking like a low bandwidth Twitch stream, you can get above 60fps on both the 2080 Ti and the Titan RTX. Even at 4K. Well, as an output of 4K rendered internally at about 720p, even here the Titan's churning out 33fps and the 2080 Ti is just below 30. Plague Tale presents a quandary. It is possible to recover most of the performance lost to ray tracing using DLSS, but whether the effect is worth it is really up to you. At 1080p, balanced DLSS brings most of the lost frames back, averaging over 60 FPS on both cards. At 1440p, retaining the 50+ experience that was possible without RT requires stepping up to DLSS performance. I dropped the 4K setting to Ultra Performance, which is actually the same render resolution as 1440p was at performance, but the extra processing still causes frame rates to drop by another 10% or so. In all three cases, you're trading off quite a lot of detail to get these more accurate shadows. Even with DLSS, Ratchet & Clank has some issues with the RTX 2080 Ti. It seems there just isn't enough VRAM for ray tracing. At 1080p with DLSS Ultra Performance, the Titan far exceeds the 2080 Ti in frame rate and gives more consistent performance. At 1440p, the 11GB card actually took several runs just to get a result that wasn't ruined by slowdown. Meanwhile, the Titan is still extremely playable. The 4K results once more show that the 2080 Ti isn't up to the task, becoming virtually unplayable at times. The Titan, meanwhile, seems to be doing pretty well. What won't come across from the numbers, however, is the awful image quality. There are visual glitches like ghosting and random shadows all over the place, which don't appear in regular rendering or indeed with FSR enabled. I don't usually recommend using DLSS Ultra Performance anyway, but in this instance, it's definitely worth steering clear. I'm gonna surprise you now. Both the 2080 Ti and Titan RTX can get playable frame rates out of Alan Wake 2 at max quality settings, all the way up to 4K. At 1080p, the average hovers around 70 FPS. At 1440p, it's approaching the mid-50s. And at 4K, both GPUs are still producing frame rates that anyone playing on a controller would find pretty acceptable. The catch? Again, I'm forced to use DLSS Ultra Performance, and while DLSS does a decent job of upscaling these incredibly low resolutions, the visuals are the highlight of the game. Star Wars Outlaws actually limits DLSS to a minimum of performance, or a 2x scaling factor below native. This means neither the 2080 Ti nor the Titan RTX can get far past 30 FPS with max RT. At 1080p, both cards are delivering reasonably playable experiences, but at 1440p it's getting dicey with averages in the 20s. Neither card can do the job at 4K, and thanks to the game's clever way of handling VRAM, the 2080 Ti looks particularly terrible. In fact, the 11GB buffer just isn't enough for RTX DI ray tracing in this game at anything above 1080p, which makes me wonder how well the 3080 is going to hold up. That review should be coming in the next few weeks. Black Myth Wukong doesn't use preset resolutions for DLSS, instead allowing you to choose a percentage. I don't yet know for certain, but I think this scaling is by area instead of linear resolution, so 50% of 2160p isn't 1080p, it's about 1527p, and 25%, which is the minimum allowed by the menu, is actually 1080p, the equivalent of DLSS performance. That means 25% doesn't look quite as bad as you might expect, and performance is actually decent. Well, compared to the same settings without DLSS, which are unplayable on both cards at all three resolutions. For this style of game, I still think the sub 30 FPS of the 4K results are too low to be enjoyable, but 1080p and 1440p are kinda working for me. Nvidia's most potent Turing GPUs would remain the only option for those gamers who are serious about ray tracing for the rest of the generation. However, 2 years after the RTX series launched, AMD finally turned in their homework and showed what the Red Team could offer in terms of RT performance. The RX 6900 XT launched at the end of 2020 and represented the best AMD had on their roster. Granted, this was after Nvidia's second generation RTX cards had launched, and I may get round to comparing the RTX 3080 Ti and the 6900 XT's ray tracing prowess in the future. Being more realistic about the Radeon's chances, however, I thought it was worth seeing how AMD's first gen RT performs compared to Nvidia's. When it comes to rendering Tomb Raider's shadows, it seems the RDNA 2 flagship was easily competing with the Turing cards. At 1080p it's particularly impressive, maintaining high refresh-worthy frame rates at every setting. Which is good, because by 2020 that's the only kind of 1080p display a gamer with a $1,000 GPU would be buying. At 1440p those frame rates are still over 100 without upscaling, but 4K is just a step too far. At the Ultra preset the average falls to the 50s and would rely on upscaling to get back to 60. I have to admit, I was surprised that Control does this well. As we'll see later on, Remedy games are usually designed with Nvidia in mind, so it's unexpected to see the 6900 XT doing better than the Titan RTX, even at the RT High presets. With an average over 60, this is still perfectly playable at 1440p, though the 30 FPS achieved at 4K is a little low for my taste, and the only way of getting FSR in this game is with a mod. Now, this is a real surprise. Cyberpunk has proven time and again that it prefers Nvidia, however, the 6900 XT is keeping pace with the GeForces at basically every preset. Only path tracing upsets the RDNA card, failing to provide a complete benchmark run at both 1440p and 4K, though with FSR enabled it once again matches the Titan for FPS. However, if you thought DLSS Ultra Performance looked bad in this game, that's just because you haven't seen FSR Ultra Performance yet. Neither will please a purist, but the FSR image quality is offensively bad. On the complete flip side, RDNA cards dominate in Forza Horizon 5, even beating their Ampere competitors. With settings maxed out and upscaling disabled, the 6900 XT remains perfectly playable even up to 4K. Plague Tale's performance drop-off when RT is enabled is bad on the GeForce GPUs, but it's even worse on the Radeon. Without RT, the 6900 XT beats both the 2080 Ti and Titan at all resolutions. But with it, the AMD performs worse than either of them. Okay, so maybe this is my fault for underestimating Ratchet & Clank, but the 16GB RX 6900 XT does not have enough VRAM for this title at higher RT settings. At 1440p, moving from high to very high takes the average from the 50s to below 20, and enabling RT at 4K sends frame rates plummeting. Which is a real shame, because that aside, the 6900 XT was doing pretty well next to the Titan. The Radeon does remarkably well in Alan Wake 2, up to a point. Without ray tracing, and even at the RT low preset, the 6900 XT is between 10 and 30% faster than the best of the Turing GPUs. At medium, path tracing comes into the picture, and the AMD card is now comparable to the 2080 Ti. At very high, it's the worst of the bunch, and even with a disgusting amount of FSR enabled, it still remains in last place. Curiously enough, despite its branding, the RTX DI setting actually works just fine on the Radeon, and up to the medium preset it even holds up against the GeForces it was named after. Pushing to high and above once more puts the 6900 XT to the bottom of the pack, and as with the other cards, high resolutions are virtually unplayable. It is possible to get playable frame rates with FSR, even at the hidden max quality setting, if you can tolerate the lousy image quality, which surely misses the whole point of using ray tracing in the first place. Finally, despite being head and shoulders clear of all the Turing cards in standard rendering, the path tracing in Black Myth is just too much for the 6900 XT. Even at 1080p it falls short of a cinematic frame rate, and beyond that it becomes Black Myth PowerPoint. Even FSR can't save it. The first generation of ray tracing cards haven't aged as poorly as one might expect. However, I think a large part of the negative reaction to them back in 2018 and 2020 was down to just that: expectations. Whether you expected ray tracing to transform the world of game graphics, or you expected your outrageously expensive new GPU to offer more than 60 FPS at 4K max settings, the RTX revolution seemed like a giant scam. 6 years on, I don't think those opinions have been at all invalidated. RT hasn't completely revolutionised graphics. Its performance impact remains disproportionate, and while these first generation GPUs aren't completely obsolete, they lean more heavily on DLSS than ever. If I'd bought one of these Turing monsters for the retail prices back in 2018, I'd be fairly pissed too. The second generation marked a significant jump in ray tracing performance, especially from the Geforce team. I've had a sneak peek at the results using the RTX 3080 Ti, and the difference, particularly in path tracing, can be night and day. That being said, the 3080 Ti is still only a 12GB card, so I've seen some of the same problems as I encountered with the 2080 Ti. It's kinda shocking just how demanding Ratchet and Clank can be. Before I make a part 2, I shall have to pick myself up a RTX 3090 or 3090 Ti. In the meantime, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.